That was a mouthful. The God of Hosea. By the discipline of cruel events, God taught Hosea much concerning the nature and character of Israel's God. Because Hosea's faith and obedience to God, he was granted insight into the deep spiritual need of his generation and was endowed with a divine message for that hour and for the present. Hosea was the prophet of the decline, death, and fall of northern Israel. The worship of God had given way to mere ritual. It was a time of moral degeneracy and spiritual adultery. With their lips, the people worshipped God, and with their hearts, they loved idols. Flagrant immorality, irreverence for the sacred, unfaithfulness, thievery, and drunkenness were the order of the day. When God wants a specific task performed, he chooses an instrument appropriate to the task. God found in the prophet Hosea a man for the hour. God told him, "Go marry a promiscuous woman," or a prostitute, "and have children with her. For like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord." Hosea was obedient to this command. The record of the prophet's experience in chapters 1 and 3 has been exposed to a wide variety of interpretation. Some take the passage simply to be a literary device to illustrate a great truth. However, most Old Testament scholars believe that Hosea was directed to marry a woman given to idolatry and adultery, which was often associated with immorality. At first, she was an unchaste woman only in a spiritual sense. She bore to her husband 3 children, to whom symbolic names were given. Eventually, idolatry brought forth its natural fruit, and Hosea's wife became an unchaste woman in a very real sense. When she then deserted her husband or was divorced by him, whether it happened either way is not definitely stated. At any rate, in obedience to the divine command, Hosea recovered his unfaithful wife and restored her to his home. The first of Hosea's children was named Jezreel, symbolizing the overthrow of the dynasty of Israel's ruling king. The second was named Lo-Ruhamah, announcing that God would have no mercy on Israel. And the third was named Lo-Ami, symbolizing the utter destruction of Israel. Now these names have prophetic significance for conditions existing in Israel as Hosea saw them. This period of preparation was not to be completed until the events of chapter 3 had transpired. And as time went by, Hosea began to notice things that caused him to wonder and worry about Gomer. He had known from the very first that she had tendencies toward idolatry. Perhaps he hoped to win Gomer to Israel's religion. But before too long, Hosea realized his effort was resulting in failure. The names which were given to the second and third children indicated that the prophet recognized he was not their father. The Bible does not describe the moment of Gomer's departure from the household of Hosea. It is impossible to know whether Hosea cast her out or whether she departed of her own free will and became a sacred prostitute in one of the pagan temples of Baal. It is impossible for one to imagine the grief, disappointment, and shame that Hosea must have experienced during these days when the wife of his youth was beloved by her friends. It was while Hosea was groping for a solution to his family problems that insight into the episode began to dawn on his consciousness. He was not the only one who had suffered. He began to see that the experience with Gomer was part of a picture of what had been happening to God and Israel for a long time. God had taken the initiative in establishing a union with Israel. He had delivered them out of Egypt. He had led them into the land which he had designated to be their home. He had shown tender love for Israel and had expected a pure, undivided affection from them. The bond between them was as close and tender as the bond of wedlock. Israel had been unfaithful to her Maker and spiritual husband. Israel had sought other lovers and found them in the Canaanite worship of Baal. God has been forsaken by the person or the people on whom he had showered the abundance of his divine love. And consequently, the people were guilty of spiritual idolatry and adultery. Out of his personal experience, Hosea begins to understand how the unfaithfulness of Israel affected the heart of God. In spite of Gomer's infidelity and shameful ways of living, Hosea discovered in his heart a continuing love for her and came to interpret this love as the clear command of God to win back his wife to better ways. We read how Hosea went to the slave market to which Gomer had descended and purchased her in order that he might redeem her from the depths of infamy into which she had fallen. He dealt with Gomer as he knew God wanted to deal with Israel. It was a stern and painful education that taught Hosea to understand the relationship between the Lord and Israel by his personal experience of what infidelity meant. Hosea entered into a new sympathy with the God of Israel, who had experienced the same things at the hand of his people. Dr. Wheeler Robinson says that Hosea was thus equipped to preach of the love of God, for his power was in his wound. An examination of the book of Hosea reveals at once how deeply the messages it contains are colored by the experience of his marriage. In this experience, Hosea learned certain great truths that we desperately need to heed today. Hosea discovered that God is love. That God is love. Hosea has been called the first prophet of grace, Israel's first evangelist. God is no impassive observer of the trials and troubles of his people. Hosea's message throbbed with an awareness of the loving kindness of God. Hosea came to a new understanding of the nature of sin. Hosea saw sin as spiritual adultery. He saw sin crushes the loving heart of the divine husband. Sin also brings suffering to the guilty. For the children of Israel shall abide many days without a king, and without a prince, and without a sacrifice, and without an image, and without an ephod, and without teraphim. In Hosea chapter 3, verse 4. It's a long time. Israel must go into exile, not because of God's punishment or justice, but because of his redemptive purposes. God does not merely punish sin, but seeks to bring about the defeat of sin. Then Hosea came to a new understanding of God's basic requirements. Hosea's concept of what required from his people, what God required from his people, can be summed up in the term faithfulness. That's what God wanted, was faithfulness. Hosea's understanding of the love of God caused him to appreciate the demands of love for utter loyalty. And this can clearly be seen in God's eager desire for the restoration of the marriage relationship. He says in chapter 2, verse 20, I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord. Hosea understood and explained the necessity of repentance. Hosea was told to reclaim Gomer, which he did by purchase. He did not restore her immediately to the position she had occupied formerly as his wife, but rather kept her on probation. On probation for an indefinite period of time. Her discipline consisted of certain deprivations. We see in chapter 3, verse 3. Hosea sought that in the presence of defiant wrongdoing, justice and punishment are the highest expressions of love. We find that hard to understand. There must be a complete interchange of attitude if Israel is to experience the richest blessings of God's love. I've often thought of Hosea's story as being the greatest love story in the Bible. The greatest love story. He married her. She was a tramp. She either walked out or he kicked her out. He went to the market and he bought her back. That's love. Hosea speaks to our present generation and tries to convince us that our God is a God of love. A God of love who suffers because of our unfaithfulness and our lack of loyalty. And we all fit into this category. Our unfaithfulness and lack of loyalty to the Lord. How quickly is something else that comes up more important than going to church and worshiping God? And I can't see whether you're smiling, snickering, or frowning, because these glasses don't let me see. But we all come up with an excuse why we don't have to. And what is it? It's an excuse. It's unfaithfulness to God. And it hurts God. And Hosea challenges us to respond to God's love with love. With love that expresses itself in devotion and loyal service. Not just for an hour on Sunday, but every moment of our lives.